Welcome, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to start with a bit of a positionality statement. A lot of the work that I've done in the Himalaya can be attributed to my caste status, my religious status. I've been able to enter into communities or villages which would be quite impossible if I was a different religion, a different caste. And so lot of that work, that's why I won't talk about some of that work today, but the reason I'm bringing this up is so that you understand that I have a lot of privilege that allows me to enter the space. And that's why I kind of want to extend my gratitude to both Pasang and Dolly for inviting me into this indigenous space. Because I don't identify as indigenous, I don't get treated as indigenous in South Asia. And that itself carries with it a remarkable amount of privilege. I don't have those burdens that Dolly and Pasang have. So in that way, thank you so much for allowing me to be here with all of you. So I am currently a lecturer at a university in New Zealand, but I came into academia kicking and screaming. I'm more of an activist. So every time people are like, well, what do you think about the academy? I'm like, is it still around? That's interesting. But so what you hear today is that a lot of my work, while is around the production of knowledge, but is around actually creating applicable or applied frameworks or systems that hold power to count, right? So it's a lot of regulatory as well as assessment-based research, because the way I see it is there's two adjacent movements happening in our world today. One of it is led by people like Pasang and Dolly, who are standing on the foundation of indigenous aspirations, right? They are not, their actions or their lives are not a response to the nation state. They're not a response to capitalism. They're not they're existing in a separate space, which is informed by what people want themselves, right? Indigenous lives are not merely a response to the oppressor. They are much more than that. So that's one lane, or that's one adjacent pathway, right? But I'm in the other pathway, which is essentially trying to rein back, trying to domesticate, trying to corral in the hyper predatory forces of the state, market, and for me, which is more important, which is science, right? I was trained as a physical and natural scientist, and then trained as a humanities and social science scholar. So I've kind of come at it through this pathway of trying to dismantle scientific imperialism, try and dismantle science from the inside. Because the truth be told, in our world today, the state or the market, that's very visible. Those are things whose footprint of oppression is quite materially visible. But science is insidious. It hides inside our institutions and pushes us towards provocations, pushes us towards forms of being which can be inherently, exploitative. So really, really far away from any kind of care. And so the way in which I envision ecologies of care is holding to account all of these very powerful forces who are, fundamentally, intentionally in many cases, trying to undermine the care work that is happening in indigenous communities on the ground. So a lot of my work is driven at the intersections of these three different things: accountability, justice, and legitimacy, right? Because a fundamental, I would say, so you can think of these as science, state, and market. It's not a clear breakdown, but inside my head it makes sense. So, as you know, science is ultimately a legitimacy granting machine, right? Its job ends up often being deciding between what is legitimate and what is not. And because it creates borders in the same way that the state creates borders, it's very interesting and important to understand whether or not those borders should exist. And if those borders don't exist, what is it that should exist in its place, right? And justice is something I know that has become somewhat fashionable as well these days. Everybody throws climate justice around. It's like the latest spice. You just sprinkle it onto a project, right? Without doing any real work. But the truth is that justice comes in many different forms. And a really powerful way of thinking about it is the fact that we now have plurinational movements across a variety of indigenous spaces where folks are saying that juridical systems that have emerged from the crucible of colonial encounter cannot judge me, right? How can your Supreme Court that was, that is standing on thousands of years of exploitation tell me what is right from what is wrong? But there is value, right? There is value in using some of those colonial architectures to get to ends that actually make sense, that actually work. And then finally, accountability. This for me is something really crucial, right? Because what I'll talk to you about today is, the ways in which we can encounter false climate solutions. And accountability is, I would say, a frame that consultants, that, essentially techno managers, they weaponize this, right? They weaponize this to essentially prove that indigenous knowledge is not worthwhile. Why? Because you can't quite capture it within the frame that we have, right? So again, accountability then serves as, fundamentally as a form of othering, right? Because if all that's happening is the powerful people are holding the disempowered people accountable, that's not accountability, right? That's just you weaponizing epistemic structures to get to your own ends. So a lot of my work kind of deals with the intersections of, these three things. So I'll give you an example of what I mean when I say false climate solutions. And one of our friends, Camelia Dewan, has written one of the best books I've ever read on false climate solutions. And this little graphic is drawn from her work on misreading the Bengal Delta. So essentially what it means is that what's happening now across the world is that climate action is predicated on what we call climate reductionism, which is reducing everything that happens in the world to climate change. Oh, I ran into some cows today on my way from work. Well, that's climate change. It's like my neighbor's bank collapsed. Definitely climate change. It's like, your corporations made massive profits this year. Definitely climate change. So it's not all climate change, right? However, it's just used in that way to, in many ways, cover our colonial and capitalist sins. Because the moment you invoke something that's beyond your control, then you no longer can be held accountable. So one of the things that Camelia shows, and one of the things that we are showing with our work, is that often the impacts of the solution meant to address climate change is worse than the climate change itself. So this is a really great example of salinization right in the lower delta in Bangladesh. What Camelia shows is that, there is this mythology out there, I would say, there's a narrative out there that, there's incredible amounts of salinization that's happening because of sea level rise due to, upper level water that's thermally expanding, and it's kind of breaching into the freshwater estuaries. But what Camelia actually shows is that, look, shrimp farming, which is being pushed as a massive climate adaptation solution, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into this. It's leading farmers to convert arable land into shrimp hatcheries, which means flooding their fields with seawater, right? Which is then also leading them to break the natural embankments, right? Which ensure year-long movement of coastal hydrology. So it is the shrimp farming which is actually salinizing fresh water, which is the response to climate change. So you see that with hydropower, with upstream hydrological management, changing the force with which fresh water is coming down, the GMB delta, the greatest delta on Earth, right? But the number of dams on it are completely changing the way in which water actually reaches these estuaries. So again, if fresh water can't really flow down, you can't really push back the saline water that's now coming into your fields. And then finally, green revolution agriculture, right? This rampant use of pesticides is slowly adding extra salt to that topsoil, which then dries out much of that soil and also then leads to salinization. But my point is that it's so easy to think of this as the solution, right? The reason for that is these solutions are made before problems are defined, right? We were talking about this a few days ago that within the climate action industry, solutions are made first, and then people go out and find some problems that they can fit those solutions to. So, what are the ways in which we can maybe intervene, maybe challenge some of these things, right? So I'll show you a couple of things that we've been working on. The first one is with Pasang, called the Knowledge Justice Protocol, and this bottom one here is the Maladaptation Assessment Tool. So together, we envision that they'll lead to a climate justice suite of tools that communities can hold, and actually use as an alternative to when the consultant shows up and says, somebody paid me $2,000 a day, so here's the report. They're like, hey, hold up, we have our own report. And this report is in the techno speak that you understand. Because for the past 50 years when we tried to tell you, you said we were stupid and ignorant because we didn't speak your science language. Look, this is your little science language. So part of it is, allowing forms of verbiage, forms of words, frameworks which the state can see, which consultants can see, and using those same tools against them, right? So looking at the Knowledge Justice Protocol, right? So there's this, real movement towards this knowledge plurality. And I definitely agree that this should be happening, right? There should be knowledge plurality that is happening. However, there's one thing that, I've seen in my work and I see it in other people's work, is there's this real obsession with this, what I call this myth of everybody getting along. It's like we need to integrate knowledge. I'm actually a firm anti-integration person. Do not integrate knowledge. Knowledge integration without knowledge equity is essentially the classic solution where one eats the other up. If there's two things that are integrating and one of it has much more power, you can bet your ass that it's gone. The second one is going to get consumed, is going to get eaten by the more powerful one. So please don't integrate knowledge if you first haven't dealt with power, right? If you haven't dealt with equity within your groups. So, one of the things that, Pasang and I are working on with other folks is understanding how we make these international reports more equitable, right? So, the Knowledge Justice Protocol within its core is understanding how our really, I would say, dynamic climate society relationships, right? Because these are relational worlds, as Pasang said. How do our climate society relationships turn into statistics, right? So it's like, how do you extract whatever scientific value science thinks is there within a relationship and shove it into a platform, right? And, there's like a variety of places of intervention, let's say, right? There's scientific publication by scholars who then have to be invited to be on a report. There's, is there even indigenous consultation? You got to meet with the chapter team and compile a data set. You got to attribute, right? You've got to say, people in Ladakh are slowly moving out of dryland agriculture and they all just want irrigation. It's probably because of climate change. Or maybe not. Maybe it's because of massive governance decisions, right? So attribution is a key one, as is extra climatic factors, which is essentially what I just said, right? You can't just call everything climate change. Finally, there's an editorial review, there's a larger report, there's a policy prism. So each number here is a point of intervention. Because the way I see some of these problems is that we've got to be able to demystify the process so that we ask for very material changes. Instead of saying, hey, let's have more inclusion, we have 10-point. This is a 10-point agenda. We pointed out this problem, here's a solution. Can you just do those things? You don't have to like hug trees and save the world. Just do those 10 things. So part of what we're working on is looking at, who or what is going to be part of this process. So at each point, what would be the intervention? Who would be the key subjects? What are the key segments of that process? And ultimately, how would you audit or regulate that process, right? So the hope is that on a report like the IPCC, you get to certify chapters as inclusive or non-inclusive, which means that when you read a document like that, you know that this chapter was produced extractively. You know that the knowledge within this chapter is inherently inequitable, which should be guiding, we hope, decisions in long-term governance and planning. Because treating all science as equal, that's completely, I would say, unethical, right? So this is a bit about the knowledge justice protocol that we're still working on. Let me move now to what I've been doing for the past year and a half. Climate adaptation is a $2 trillion market. Now, this is a very low valuation because they haven't quite counted futures markets. They haven't counted like a lot of informal voluntary markets that are set up on conflict zones. I would say, if you ask me my professional opinion, this is a $5 trillion market. So a $5 trillion market, that means it's basically bigger than every economy on earth other than like 2 or 3. So we are seeing the next big thing unravel in front of our eyes. What are we going to do to hold this accountable? And this is what we are seeing also in the scholarly text is that we are seeing a popular protest movements against climate adaptation. Now, these are not right-wing anti-science protests. These are from communities in the global south whose livelihoods, whose lives, whose cultural presence, whose sovereignty itself has been damaged, has been completely, let's say, threatened by adaptation projects. So most of them, if you see 35%, are actually resettlement, retreat, and evictions, where folks are like, hey, let's move you off this coastline and put you somewhere else, right? There's just quite a lot going on here. And this is from a recent Nature paper where they kind of look at a variety of ways in which adaptation projects are good or bad. And my point is that I'm not a big fan of this paper. It's, if you ask me, there's a lot of problems with it. But what it does do is it kind of like breaks it down into the variety of different subjectivities that are involved in climate action. And that a project that might actually be great for, I don't know, rich people living on the wharf is absolutely disastrous for communities of color further inland. So what we are seeing is, a lot of these challenges of adaptation projects. So what my team and I did over the last year and a half is we created this thing called the MAT, the Maladaptation Assessment Tool, and tried it out in one indigenous community up here in in the North Island of New Zealand, one at this Franz Josef Glacial Reserve here, and over here in Ashburton. So these two are rural communities, and that one's an indigenous community, which is dealing with the aftermath of a flood response, right? So the response to the flood was actually just as bad as the flooding itself. So when we use the MAT, one of the things we do is, this is sort of at the heart and soul of the MAT itself, which is how does a relationship become an indicator, right? Because these consultants are obsessed with indicators. So we were like, hold on. So you have this risk assessment that you took from 1950s development studies. Let's not do that. Let's do this instead. So this is tuna or longfin eel, which is at the heart of Maori food sovereignty, right? And if you see, there's a whole bunch of different relationships that, the iwi, which is the tribe, has with the tuna. And so there's whakapapa and identity, like genealogy, where we come from, kinship, our relationship. Taonga species, so taonga is a treasure. So this is a treasure species, right? Because it has existed on these lands for millennia. Safe to eat, ecological integrity. I love all of this, right? Ability to support intergenerational knowledge transfer. And now all of this, I didn't come up with these. These are from meetings that we had with indigenous stakeholders on the ground, right? Ability to use preferred harvest and storage, to trade between whānau is family. Manakitanga, right? Food for manuhiri, which means food for guests. When people visit us, I'm not going to give them Doritos, right? This is what guests eat. So how do you turn all this into indicators so that when we actually do assessments, this is what shows up, right? This shows up in a way that then confronts the classical risk assessment model. So we ran this maladaptation assessment tool on the flooding response in that region up in Hawke's Bay. And what you see is we have these domains, right, within the tool, which is undermining existing policy planning, crisis politics, so essentially like using the words or using the definitions of disaster to suspend civil rights and civil liberties and push through legislation at a fast rate. Mimicking climate impacts, which is a very common thing that happens in adaptation projects. So adaptation projects start mimicking the exact impacts of climate change. Reinforcing injustices, right, which we just talked about. Undermining existing legislation, this is on the juridical end. Undermining autonomous adaptation, so adaptation that's driven by indigenous communities. And then finally, undermining indigenous sovereignty, rangatiratanga. My point is, as you can see, on almost every domain, this project is maladaptive, which means it's going to fail. It is going to do exactly opposite of what it was planned to do. But now that the community had this report, they took it to the negotiating table with the regional council. I'm not saying that this alone was what helped them get more time, but this supported the movement that the tribal council had and said, oh, hold on, all these options that you've given us, they are pretty bad. But them bringing this language of science along with them in a bag and plopping it on the table and saying, we see your assessment, this is ours. It kind of allowed for the power to shift a little bit in the room. So I'll kind of end right now by saying that for me, ecologies of care is all about supporting non-elite and modern colonial environmentalism, right? It's about three things, and this is something I've been working on with my partner and with Pasang and with some other folks. What we see across the world is that environmentalism itself, non-elite environmentalism, and the reason I call it non-elite is that we all know what's happening in places like India where decolonization is being weaponized by the elite to push back against a whole bunch of ideas that is being leveled at them. So it's very important to realize that things like caste and patriarchy are far more ancient injustices than colonization. So this is what we see across the world, right? We see it in the Amazon, we see it in the Himalaya, we're seeing it in the Pacific, is that there's an attempt to domestic capitalism by indigenous communities. And there's also this challenge being leveled at algorithmic truth-telling, right? What we see within the climate community is that because of the constant attacks from science denialism, we see a real massive, I would say, suspension of human-centered risk assessments, human-driven ideas of what our world is, and then we are essentially, outsourcing our truth-telling, our storytelling to algorithms. But who builds these algorithms, right? So this is part of what I'm working on next, whenever I have a minute, is developing justice-centered algorithms, right? DNA algorithms that are inside climate impacts are so problematic. They are, anyway, I'm not gonna go into that right now, but let's just say there's a lot of issues there. And then finally, plurinational belonging, right? Can the nation state truly represent hundreds of different ideas, ethnicities, people who it's supposedly representing, right? So I would say that, in short, there is a real need to, for someone like me to work on that adjacent space from Pasang and Dolly to kind of allow, to corral in this really powerful, set of processes that are now significantly underlying climate action. So thank you so much for your time, and any questions?